It was eerily silent. The first 9 planes, Superman out front, crossed the island unopposed. The air was very still, and the plane glided along without a ripple. Phil relinquished control to the Norden bomb site. Superman's first target, a knot of planes and structures beside a runway, came into view. Louis lined up on the gleaming backs of the planes. And then, shattering, the sky became a fury of color, sound, and motion. Flak hissed up, trailing streamers of smoke over the plains, then burst into black puffs, sparkling with shrapnel. Metal flew everywhere, streaking up from below and raining down from above. With the bomb site in control, Phil could do nothing. Something struck the bomber on Superman's left wing, piloted by Lieutenant John Jacobs. The plane sank as if drowning. At almost the same moment, the plane to Superman's right was hit. Just a few feet away, Pillsbury watched the bomber falter, drop, and disappear under Superman's wing. Pillsbury could see the men inside, and his mind briefly registered that all of them were about to die. Superman was alone. Louis kept his focus below, trying to aim for the parked planes. As he worked, there was a tremendous bang and a terrific shudder. Much of Superman's right rudder, a chunk the size of a dinner table, blew off. Louis lost the target, and as he tried to find it again, a shell bit a wide hole in the bomb bay, and the plane rocked again. At last, Louis had his aim, and the first bombs dropped, spun down, and struck the targets. Then Superman passed over a set of red-roofed barracks and an anti-aircraft battery, Louis's second and third targets. Louis lined up and watched the bombs crunch into the buildings and battery. He had 1 bomb left for a target of opportunity. North of the airfield, he saw a shack and took aim. The bomb fell clear, and Louis yelled "bombs away" and turned the valve to close the bomb bay doors. In the cockpit, the bomb release light flicked on, and Phil took control of the plane. As he did, behind and below the plane, there was a pulse of white light and an orb of fire. Louis had made a lucky guess and a perfect drop. The shack was a fuel depot, and he had struck it dead center. In the top turret, Pillsbury pivoted backward and watched a vast cloud of smoke billow upward. Oh my. Here's a picture of a B-24 making its way through anti-aircraft fire. Do you see that? Sorry, the glare. I can see the glare is a mess. There was no time for celebration. Zeros were suddenly all around. Louis counted 9 of them, slashing around the bombers, machine guns blazing. The boldness and skill of the Japanese pilots astounded the bomber crews. The Zeros flew at the bombers head-on, cannons firing, slicing between planes that were just feet apart. They passed so close that Louis could see the faces of the pilots. Firing furiously, the bomber gunners tried to take out the Zeros. The shooting was all point blank, and bullets were flying everywhere. One bomber sustained 17 hits from friendly planes, or possibly from its own waist guns. Stricken bombers began slipping behind, and the Zeros pounced. One bomber was hounded by 4 Zeros and a biplane. Its gunners shot down 1 Zero before the pilot found a cloud to hide in, scattering his pursuers. Below, Lieutenant Jacobs, Phil's lost wingman, was still airborne, his plane laboring along on 3 engines and no right rudder in a circle of Zeros. His gunners sent 1 Zero down. Thor Hamrin, pilot of the B-24, jab in the ass, saw Jacobs struggling. Circling back and speeding down, he opened up on the Zeros with all his guns. The Zeros backed off, and Jacobs flew on with Hamrin on his wing. The first bombers, pursued by Zeros, headed out to sea. With its fighters gone and many of its guns destroyed, the Japanese base was left exposed. The trailing B-24s swept in, crossing through rivers of smoke to rain bombs on the phosphate plant. In the last plane over the island, a reporter raised his binoculars. He saw a volcano-like mass of smoke and fire, a burning Japanese bomber, a few bursts of anti-aircraft fire, and not a single moving person. Phil and Cuppernail pushed Superman full throttle for home. The plane was gravely wounded, trying to fly up and over onto its back. It wanted to stall and wouldn't turn, and the pilots needed all their strength to hold it level. 3 Zeros orbited it, spewing streams of bullets and cannon shells. The gunners, engulfed in scalding hot spent cartridges, fired back. Mitchell in the nose, Pillsbury in the top turret, Glassman in the belly, Lambert in the tail, and Brooks and Douglas standing exposed at the broad open waist windows. Louis, still in the greenhouse, saw rounds ripping through the Zero's fuselages and wings, but the planes were relentless. Bullets streaked through Superman from every direction. In every part of the plane, the sea and sky were visible through gashes in the bomber's skin. Every moment, the holes multiplied. Just as Louis turned to leave the greenhouse, he saw a Zero dive straight for Superman's nose. Mitchell and the Zero pilot fired simultaneously. Louis and Mitchell felt bullets cutting the air around them, one passing near Mitchell's arms, the other just missing Louis's face. One round sizzled past and struck the turret's power line, and the turret went dead. At the same instant, Louis saw the Zero pilot jerk. Mitchell had hit him. For a moment, the Zero continued to speed directly at the nose of Superman. Then, the weight of the stricken pilot on the yoke forced the Zero down, ducking under the bomber. The fighter powered down and splashed into the ocean just short on the beach. Louis rotated the dead turret by hand, and Mitchell climbed out. The gunners kept firing, and Superman trembled on. There were still 2 Zeros circling it. In the top turret, facing backward, Stanley Pillsbury had fearsome weapons, twin 50 caliber machine guns. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, the bullets traveling about 3,000 feet per second. Pillsbury's guns could kill a man from 4 miles away, and they could take out a Zero if given the chance, but the Zeros were staying below, where Pillsbury couldn't hit them. He could feel their rounds thumping into Superman's belly, but all he could see were his plane's wings. Fixated on the nearest Zero, Pillsbury thought, if he'd just come up, I can knock him down. He waited. The plane groaned and shook. The gunners fired. The Zeros pounded them from below, and still Pillsbury waited. Then Louis saw a Zero swoop up the right. Pillsbury never saw it. The first he knew of it was an ear-splitting kabang, kabang, kabang sensation of everything tipping and blowing apart in excruciating pain. The Zero had sprayed the entire right side of Superman with cannon shells. The first rounds hit near the tail, spinning the plane hard on its side. Shrapnel tore into the hip and left leg of tail gunner Ray Lambert, who hung on sideways as Superman rolled. The plane's twist saved him. A cannon round struck exactly where his head had been an instant earlier. hitting so close to him that his goggles shattered. Ahead, shrapnel dropped Brooks and Douglas at the waist guns. In the belly turret, 2 hunks of shrapnel penetrated the back of Glassman, who was so adrenalized that he felt nothing. Another round hit the passenger Nelson. Finally, a shell blew out the wall of the top turret, disintegrating on impact and shooting metal into Pillsbury's leg from foot to knee. Half of the crew and all of the working gunners had been hit. Superman reeled crazily on its side, and for a moment it felt about to spiral out of control. Phil and Cuppernail wrenched it level, clinging to his gun as the shrapnel struck his leg and the plane's spin nearly flung him from his seat. Pillsbury shouted the only word that came to mind: "Ow." Louis heard someone scream. When the plane was righted, Phil yelled to him to find out how bad the damage was. Louis climbed from the nose turret. The first thing he saw was Harry Brooks in the bomb bay, lying on the catwalk. The bomb bay doors were wide open, and Brooks was dangling partway off the catwalk, one hand gripping the catwalk and one leg swinging in the air with nothing but air and ocean below him. His eyes bulged. His upper body was wet with blood. He lifted one arm toward Louis, a plaintive expression on his face. Louis grabbed Brooks by the wrists and pulled him into a seated position. Brooks slumped forward, and Louis could see holes dotting the back of his jacket. There was blood in his hair. Louis dragged Brooks to the flight deck and pulled him into a corner. Brooks passed out. Louis found a cushion and slid it under him, then returned to the bomb bay. He remembered having turned the valve to close the doors and couldn't understand why they were open. Then he saw. There was a slash in the wall, and purple fluid was splattered everywhere. The hydraulic lines which controlled the doors had been severed. With these lines broken, Phil would have no hydraulic control of the landing gear or the flaps, which they would need to slow the plane on landing, and without hydraulics, they had no brakes. Louis cranked the bomb bay doors shut by hand. He looked to the rear and saw Douglas, Lambert, and Nelson lying together, bloody. Douglas and Lambert were pawing along the floor, trying to reach their guns. Nelson didn't move. He'd taken a shot to the stomach. Louis shouted to the cockpit for help. Phil yelled back that he was losing control of the plane and needed Cuppernail. Louis said that this was a dire emergency. Phil braced himself at the controls, and Cuppernail got up, saw the men in back, broke into a run. He found morphine, sulfa, oxygen masks, and bandages, and dropped down next to each man in turn. Louis knelt beside Brooks, who was still unconscious. Feeling through the gunner's hair, he found 2 holes in the back of his skull. There were 4 large wounds on his back. Louis strapped an oxygen mask to Louis's face and bandaged his head. As he worked, he thought about the state of the plane. The waist, nose, and tail gunners were out. The plane was shot to hell. Phil was alone in the cockpit, barely keeping the plane up, and the Zeros were still out there. One more pass, he thought, will put us down. Louis was bending over Brooks when he felt a tickle on his shoulder, something dripping. He looked up and saw Pillsbury in the top turret. Blood was streaming from his leg. Louis rushed to him. Pillsbury was still in his seat, facing sideways, gripping the gun and sweeping his eyes around the sky. He looked absolutely livid. His leg dangled below him, his pant leg hanging in shreds, and his boot blasted. Next to him was a jagged hole the shape of Texas and almost as large as a beach ball, clawed out of the side of the plane. The turret was shot with holes, and the floor was jiggling with flakes of metal and turret motor. Louis began doctoring Pillsbury's wounds. Pillsbury, swinging his head back and forth, ignored him. He knew that the Zero would come back to finish the kill, and he had to find it. The urgency of the moment drove the pain into a distant place. Wow, there's a picture of Pillsbury. Suddenly, there was a whoosh of dark, close, upward motion, a gray, shining body, a red circle. Pillsbury shouted something unintelligible, and Louis let go of his foot just as Pillsbury banged the high-speed rotator on his turret. The turret grunted to life, whirling Pillsbury around 90 degrees. The Zero reached the top of its arc, leveled off, and sped directly toward Superman. Pillsbury was terrified. In an instant, the end would come with the most minute of gestures, the flick of the Zero pilot's finger on his cannon trigger, and Superman would carry 10 men into the Pacific. Pillsbury could see the pilot who would end his life. The tropical sun illuminating his face, a white scarf coiled around his neck. Pillsbury thought, I have to kill this man. Pillsbury sucked in its sharp breath and fired. He watched the tracers skim away from his gun's muzzle and punch through the cockpit of the Zero. The windshield blew apart and the pilot pitched forward. The fatal blow never came to Superman. The Zero pilot, surely seeing the top turret smashed and the waist windows vacant, had probably assumed that the gunners were all dead. He had waited too long. The Zero folded onto itself like a wounded bird. Pillsbury felt sure that the pilot was dead before his plane struck the ocean. The last Zero came up from below, then faltered and fell. Clarence Douglas, standing at the waist gun, with his thigh, chest, and shoulder torn open, and brought it down. In the ocean behind them, the men on the submarine watched the planes tussle over the water. One by one, the Zeros dropped and the bombers flew on. The submarine crew would later report that not one Zero made it back to Nauru. It is believed that thanks to this raid and others, the Japanese never retrieved a single shipment of phosphate from the island. The pain that had been far away during the gunfight surged over Pillsbury. Louis pushed the release on the turret chair, and the gunner slid into his arms. Louis eased him to the floor next to Brooks. Grasping Pillsbury's boot, he began easing it off as gently as he could. Pillsbury hollered for all he was worth. The boot slid off. Pillsbury's big left toe was gone. It was still in the boot. The toe next to it hung on by a string of skin. The portions of the other toes were missing. So much shrapnel was embedded in his lower leg that it bristled like a pincushion. Ugh. Louis thought that there would be no way to save the foot. He bandaged Pillsbury, gave him a shot of morphine, fed him a sulfa pill, then hurried away to see if they could save the plane. Superman was dying. Phil couldn't turn it from side to side with the normal controls, and the plane was pulling upward so hard, trying to flip, that Phil couldn't hold it with his arms. He put both feet on the yoke and pushed as hard as he could. The nose kept rearing up so high that the plane was on the verge of stalling. It was porpoising up and down. The men who could walk rushed through the plane, assessing its condition. The peril of their situation was abundantly clear. The right rudder was completely shot, a large portion of it missing, and its cables severed. The cables for the elevators, which controlled the plane's pitch, were badly damaged. So were the cables for the trim, which gave the pilot fine control of the plane's altitude, its orientation in the air, and thus greatly reduced the effort needed to handle the plane. Fuel was trickling onto the floor under the top turret. No one knew the condition of the landing gear, but with the entire plane perforated, it was likely that the tires had been struck. The bomb bay was sloshing with hydraulic fluid. Phil did what he could. Slowing the engines on one side created a power differential that forced the plane to turn. Pushing the plane to higher speed eased the porpoising and reduced the risk of stalling. If Phil kept his feet on the yoke and pushed hard, he could stop the plane from flipping. Someone shut off the fuel feed near Pillsbury and the leaking stopped. Louis took a bomb-arming wire and spliced the severed rudder and elevator cables together. It didn't result in immediate improvement, but if the left rudder cables failed, it might help. Funafuti was 5 hours away. If Superman could carry them that far, they would have to land without hydraulic control of the landing gear, flaps, or brakes. They could lower the gear and extend the flaps with hand pumps, but there was no manual alternative to hydraulic brakes. Without bombs or much fuel aboard, the plane weighed some 40,000 pounds. A B-24 without brakes, especially one coming in hot, over the standard of 90 to 100 miles per hour, 110 miles per hour landing speed, could eat up 10,000 feet before it stopped. Funafuti's runway was 6,660 feet long. Oh my, not even close. It needs 10,000 feet, and it's only 6,600 feet. At the end were rocks and sea. Hours passed. Superman shook and struggled. Louis and Cupernell moved among the injured men. Pillsbury lay on the floor, watching his leg bleed. Mitchell hunched over his navigation table, and Phil wrestled with the plane. Douglas limped about, looking deeply traumatized, his shoulder and arm, said Pillsbury, all torn to pieces. Brooks lay next to Pillsbury, blood pooling in his throat, making him gurgle as he breathed. Pillsbury couldn't bear the sound. Once or twice when Louis knelt before him, Brooks opened his eyes and whispered something. Louis put his ear near Brooks's lips, but couldn't understand him. Brooks drifted off again. Everyone knew he was almost surely dying. No one spoke of it. It was likely they all knew that they'd crash on landing, if not before. Whatever thoughts each man had, he kept them to himself. Daylight was fading when the palms of Funafuti brushed over the horizon. Phil began dropping the plane toward the runway. They were going much too fast. Someone went to the hand crank on the catwalk and opened the bomb bay doors, and the plane, dragging on the air, began to slow. Douglas went to the pump for the landing gear, just under the top turret. He needed 2 hands to work it, one to push the valve and one to work the pump, but he was in too much pain to hold up either of his arms for more than a few seconds. Pillsbury couldn't stand, but by stretching as far as he could, he reached the selector valve. Together, they got the gear down while Louis peered out the side window, looking for a yellow tab that would signify that the gear was locked. The tab appeared. Mitchell and Louis pumped the flaps down. Louis scrounged up parachute cord and went to each injured man, looping cord around him as a belt, then wrapping the rope around stationary parts of the plane. Nelson, with his belly wound, couldn't have a rope wrapped around his torso, so Louis fed the line around his arm under his armpit. Fearing that they'd end up on fire, he didn't knot the cords. Instead, he wound the ends around the hands of the injured men so they could free themselves easily. The question of how to stop the bomber remained. Louis had an idea. What if they tied 2 parachutes to the rear of the plane? pitched them out of the waist windows at touchdown, and pulled the ripcords. No one had ever tried to stop a bomber in this manner. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Louis and Douglas placed one parachute in each waist window and tied them to a gun mount. Douglas went to his seat, leaving Louis standing between the waist windows, a ripcord in each hand. Superman sank through footy. Below, the journalists and the other bomber crews stood, watching the crippled plane come in. Superman dropped lower and lower. Just before it touched down, Pillsbury looked at the airspeed gauge. It read 110 miles per hour. For a plane without brakes, it was too fast. For a moment, the landing was perfect. The wheels kissed the runway so softly that Louis stayed on his feet. Then came a violent gouging sensation. What they had feared had happened. The left tire was flat. The plane caught hard, veered left, and careened toward two parked bombers. Cuppernell, surely more out of habit than hope, stomped on the right brake. There was just enough hydraulic fluid left to save them. Superman spun in a circle and lurched to a stop just clear of the other bombers. Louis was still in the back, gripping the parachute cords. He had not had to use them. Here's a footnote. 8 months later, Charlie Pratt became the first pilot to stop a B-24 with parachutes. His bomber, Belle of Texas, had been shot up over the Marshall Islands and had no brakes, leaving Pratt to attempt a landing on a runway far too short for bombers. To make matters worse, Pratt had eaten bad eggs and was vomiting as he flew. Touching down at a scorching 140 miles per hour, Pratt ordered his men to deploy 3 parachutes, with the parachutes open behind it. The plane shot off the end of the runway and onto the beach before stopping short of the ocean. Pratt and his crew were given special commendations. Just lost my page. Okay. Douglas popped open the top hatch, dragged himself onto the roof, raised an injured arm over his head, and crossed it with the other arm, the signal that there were wounded men inside. Louis jumped down from the bomb bay and gave the same signal. There was a stampede across the airfield, and in seconds the plane was swarming with Marines. Louis stood back and ran his eyes over the body of his ruined plane. Later, ground crewmen would count the holes in Superman, marking each one with chalk to make sure they didn't count it twice. There were 594 holes. All of the Nauru bombers had made it back. Every one of them shot up, but none so badly as this. Brooks had laid on a stretcher, placed on a jeep, and driven to a rudimentary one-room infirmary. He was bleeding inside his skull. They carried Pillsbury to a barracks to await treatment. He was lying there about an hour when the doctor came in and asked him if he knew Harry Brooks. Pillsbury said yes. He didn't make it, the doctor said. Technical Sergeant Harold Brooks died 1 week before his 23rd birthday. It took more than a week for word to reach his widowed mother, Edna, at 511 Western Avenue in Clarksville, Michigan. Across town on Harley Road, the news reached his fiancée, Jeanette Bircher. She learned that he was gone 9 days before the wedding date that they had set before he left for the war. Oh my. That's a tough chapter. We'll take a break for the weekend and we'll be back on Monday with chapter 10, and the chapter is called The Stinking Six. Let's say our bedtime prayer. Holy God, we thank you for this time together, and we thank you for this chance to rest and rejuvenate our bodies. We ask that you would give us rest and that we would sleep well and wake with the ability to do your work in whatever way you would have us do it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.